Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. Today we're continuing our look at the book Supernatural by Dr. Michael Heiser, and we're looking specifically at the concept of sacred space. The concept of sacred space will take us on a trajectory from the construction of the tabernacle at Mount Sinai, the conquest of Canaan by Joshua, the defeat of Goliath of Gath by David, the building of the temple by Solomon, and even to the question of sacred space at the time of the birth of Christ. But our journey begins, again, in the Garden of Eden.
At the initial point of creation, there was a place called the Garden of Eden where heaven and earth mingled together. We see that God had a particular entrance to the garden that he guarded with the cherubim in Genesis 3, verse 24. So he drove out the man and placed cherubim east of the Garden of Eden and a flaming turning sword to guard the way to the tree of life. The implication is that there was one way in at the east, and that place was guarded by the cherubim after we were no longer allowed in it. And there's an interesting verse from the book of Revelation that talks about the Garden of Eden. Revelation chapter 2, verse 7. The one who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will grant to him to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. The word paradise is a key word here. Our English usage of this term has come to basically mean any ideal utopia, a place of plenty and peacefulness and natural beauty. But in the first century, the term that's translated as paradise here was actually a technical term for a walled garden, like the gardens of Babylon, or like any garden that a king might have. Even the kings of Israel had these walled gardens that were the property of the king and were a creation. It wasn't wild nature, it was cultivated nature in a garden environment that was walled in and exclusive. This picture from Revelation reinforces the idea that Eden was a discrete spot that God had specifically cultivated and created within the natural realm. And even within that garden, we know that there was a place at the center of it, in the midst of the garden, what was even more restricted by God's command, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The people were not supposed to eat of that tree. It had its own special rules. So within the garden, there was one particular spot that was even more set apart than the rest of the garden. So there was a core center where the trees were, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They apparently grew close to one another at the heart of the garden. And around them was the rest of the Garden of Eden, possibly enclosed, but definitely separate space. And then outside of that was the rest of the planet Earth. There is a picture here of what is sacred space. Sacred space is space dedicated specifically to God and to his presence and to his worship. And in the garden, we had a plan of sacred space. We had the very heart of the garden that was the most sacred, where a rule limited access, then the rest of the garden, and then the planet. And this pattern of sacred space is a pattern that persists through the scriptures. But this particular arrangement of sacred space was not to last. There was sin in the garden. They did eat of the tree that they were not supposed to. They violated that sacred space, and the whole Edenic pattern of sacred space was broken. The distance between humanity and the divine is widened over and over again. We read a good summary of that, I think, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 12, when God looks on the earth, and it's kind of a reversal of what he sees in Genesis 1 when he looks on the earth and says it's good. But here in Genesis chapter 6, verse 12, God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. So whatever sacred space was created initially had become corrupted And whether there was any tangible remnants of the Garden of Eden before the flood, I think it's safe to say that after the flood, any tangible remnants of that garden were lost. We might as well say that at this point, there was no sacred space on earth. It had all been corrupted and then destroyed. But this was not a surprise to God. He knew humanity. He made us. He knows our weaknesses. He knows our flaws. And he knows that we are not going to be able to maintain that sacred space. And he was ready to move in with a new phase after the failure to maintain the space in the Garden of Eden. And after the Tower of Babel, he begins a new phase of this plan by selecting Abram, and then Abraham, and starting to create a special nation where he will maintain his close, intimate relationship with the people in that nation and will keep alive the idea of sacred space and of this ultimate joining of heaven and earth. That would be the nation of Israel, of course. And he revealed himself as the angel of the Lord in physical ways, tangible ways, with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, and with other patriarchs and important figures in the history of Israel. God personally appeared. That appearance in tangible form was called the angel of the Lord, or the angel of Yahweh. At Sinai, God expressed that through the angel that would protect Israel on their way to the promised land. While they were at Sinai, they received the law. I believe that the law was given partly to create a form of sacred space on earth, a form that paralleled Eden. At the heart is the temple, first the tabernacle that they created as they were at Sinai and traveling. And here in Exodus chapter 36, verse 8, it talks about the skilled workmen who are going to make the tent itself, the canvas or cloth that would define the outside of that tent. Not the border of the whole tabernacle area, the outside tents, just basically making a courtyard, but the inside tent that created the holy space and the Holy of Holies. And this tent is described here in Exodus 36:8. All who were skilled of heart among the doers of the work made the tabernacle with 10 curtains of finely twisted linen and blue and purple and crimson yarns. With cherubim, he made them, the work of a skilled craftsman. Blue and purple and crimson yarn is difficult to make and very expensive, so there's a certain amount of exclusivity already in the curtains there. But the presence of the cherubim are what I wanted to highlight, because that was a part of the Garden of Eden. They were these guardian spirits, and the curtain had depictions of the cherubim there. Within that curtain, what was on the other side of that curtain was special sacred space. Inside the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. And the description here in chapter 37 of Exodus, verses 6 through 9, and he made an atonement cover of pure gold, 2.5 cubits in length and 1.5 cubits its width. And he made 2 cherubim of gold. He made them of hammered work at the 2 ends of the atonement cover. 1 cherub was at one end, and 1 cherub was at the other end of the atonement cover. He made the cherubim at its 2 ends. And the cherubim were with outspread wings above, covering with their wings over the atonement cover and facing each other. The faces of the cherubim were toward the atonement cover. The most holy spot inside this tabernacle was decorated with cherubim statuary, if you will. So the 2-dimensional cherubim that were embroidered into the curtains were enclosing a space with 3-dimensional cherubim. And just outside this Holy of Holies was a lampstand. Let's read the description there, Exodus 37, 17 through 19. And he made the lampstand of pure gold. He made the lampstand of hammered work. Its base and its branch, its cups, its buds, and its blossoms were all part of it. And 6 branches were going out from its sides, 3 branches of the lampstand from its one side, and 3 branches of the lampstand from the second side. 3 almond flower cups were on one branch with a bud and a blossom, and 3 almond flower cups were on one branch with a bud and a blossom, likewise for the 6 branches going out from the lampstand. What was the lampstand to represent, apart from just being a source of light? It was a tree. This lampstand could very well stand in for the trees in the Garden of Eden. Maybe the general trees that filled the garden, or maybe the tree of life at the heart of the garden. It was a source of light, just like life and light are very often tied together in Scripture. The vision of Zechariah with the lamp that was surrounded on either side by olive trees. There's this one central lampstand with trees on either side. And here in the Holy of Holies, we also have a lampstand that actually is a tree in its shape and design. The temple was also meant to be a representation of Eden, not just the tabernacle that they carried around with him. So in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 29, we read, "On all of the walls of the temple around the house, he carved engravings of cherubim and palm tree images and budding flowers, both inside and out." All of this, cherubim, the lampstand tree, the food that was in there, because they actually put loaves of bread on a table. In the Holy of Holies, there was food to eat. There was light from a tree. There was the cherubim protecting it. The heart of the temple and the tabernacle before it was a kind of miniature Eden, establishing sacred space. Now, it may not be any much of a stretch to say that the tabernacle was sacred space, or the temple was sacred space. That pretty much goes without saying. But what about the outside of the tabernacle, the camp of Israel, or the nation of Israel, within the bounds of territories for the 12 tribes? How was that holy beyond the temple or tabernacle area? It was considered so. Look at this from Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 12 through 14. "And there shall be for you a designated place outside the camp, and you shall go there to relieve yourself. And a digging tool shall be included in addition to your other utensils for yourself. And then when you relieve yourself outside the camp, you shall dig with it, and then you shall turn and you shall cover your excrement. For Yahweh your God is walking about in the midst of your camp to deliver you, and to hand your enemies over to you before you. And so let your camp be holy, so that he shall not see in it anything indecent." I think poop would count as indecent. So no, nothing indecent in the camp. "And he shall turn away from going with you," if there was that indecency in the camp. It was beyond the temple. They were to keep their camp clean because it was holy. It was a place where Yahweh would be. He wasn't just restricted to being there in that one spot in the camp. He could go throughout the entire camp. And so the camp needed to be clean. More than just the tabernacle that's considered holy. And it extends into other areas as well. In the book of Numbers, chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, we read that Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Command the Israelites, they must send everyone from the camp who is afflicted with a rash, everyone with a fluid discharge, everyone unclean through contact with the corpse. You will send away both male and female, and you will send them outside the camp. They must not make unclean their camps where I am dwelling in their midst." So the Israelites did so. They sent them away outside the camp. Just as Yahweh spoke to Moses, so did the Israelites. It wasn't just the poop that needed to be kept outside the camp. All of these things that were considered unclean would be taken outside of the camp. The idea of holy and unholy is one set of ideas, and then the idea of clean and unclean is a different but connected set. And the Levites were specifically tasked with knowing what was holy and what was unholy, what was clean and what was unclean. We see this in Leviticus. In Leviticus chapter 10, verse 10, in a longer sentence, but here at the heart of this, Aaron and his sons are tasked with distinguishing between the holy and the unholy, as well as between the unclean and the clean. And in English, holy and unholy are basically the same word. with just a prefix for unholy, and clean and unclean are the same word with just unclean. But in Hebrew, there are actually 4 different words here, not just variations of 2 words, but 4 different words. They had like, this is a whole different category. Holy is one thing, unholy is a different thing entirely. Clean is one thing, and unclean is something else. But they are opposites, still opposites. You still cannot be holy and unholy at the same time. And you cannot be clean and unclean at the same time. And holiness was something that was dedicated to the use of Yahweh. And if you weren't exclusively devoted to God's use and his purposes, then you were unholy. We might just call it common. It's not like it's anything necessarily wrong with it. You have to have a lot of common things. Not everything can be dedicated exclusively to Yahweh's use, or we just couldn't function. It would all belong in the temple and nothing would be for anybody else. So it's not bad for something to be unholy. It's just not dedicated to his exclusive use. And it's sort of the same with clean and unclean. Something that was considered clean was appropriate to be in the presence of holiness, to be part of the process of a holy act or a holy function. So being clean puts you in a proper mode to be used for holy things and in holy ways. Being unclean, not that there was anything necessarily bad with it, inherently bad, it just wasn't appropriate. Not appropriate to be used for a holy purpose and in a context of holiness. So unclean, it's like the people who got sick, who had the rash or whatever, they weren't inherently bad people, but it was not appropriate to be in the presence of holiness, and therefore not appropriate to be in the camp, because the camp was holy. It was devoted to the Lord. Holy and unholy, and clean and unclean. And in fact, one of the main actions of the calendar year in the sacred space of the tabernacle was the Day of Atonement. And we kind of think about atonement in our minds, I think, as forgiveness of sins, like not holding against you anymore that you did something wrong. But that's really not the idea of the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was about being clean. The tabernacle was always holy. But over the course of a year of people coming and going into the outer court and offering their sacrifices and their fellowship offerings and just hanging around, unclean people were part of the process. We just can't help it. Humans are just inherently unclean at times. The tabernacle and the temple later would be tainted, if you will, by the unclean people who just routinely used it. The Day of Atonement was to reset everything, clean it of the spiritual uncleanness that had tainted it. And we read about that in Leviticus chapter 16, verse 33. It's kind of a summary statement after the details of what happens on the Day of Atonement. And he says, and therefore he, Aaron, shall make atonement for the sanctuary's holy place, and shall make atonement for the tent of assembly and the altar. And he shall make atonement for the priests and for all of the assembly's people. You know, when it comes to mentioning the priests and the people, our idea of forgiveness of sins and the idea of atonement kind of start overlapping. But how do you forgive a place? How do you forgive an altar or the tent? It's not really about forgiving them. It's about cleaning them, about getting that unclean corruption off and resetting it, restoring it back to its state of being worthy of being holy. What about when they got to the Holy Land? It was meant to be a memory of Eden as well. And in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 7 through 10, we read a description given by Yahweh through Moses that really sounds like it's going to be Eden again, going to be that perfect paradise. For Yahweh your God is bringing you to a good land with streams of water, springs and underground water welling up in the valleys and in the hills, to a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranate trees, a land of olive trees and olive oil and honey, to a land where you may eat food without scarcity, and you will not find anything lacking in it. A land where its stones are iron, and from its mountains you can mine copper. And you will eat, and you will be satisfied, and you will bless Yahweh your God because of the good land that he has given you. Notice how he starts and ends with good land. Eretz Tov. Tov was that word God used to declare his creation good when he first created it. And the land of Israel would be a good land, a place of goodness. And all of the abundance is described here as one would assume there was in Eden, because until the curse on man, man didn't have to work for the food. It wasn't hard to raise his crops or to reap the harvest. If the people had remained faithful, God said it's going to be like that here. And even the mention of iron from the mountains and copper and the mineral wealth that would be found there, we see mineral wealth being equated with Eden as well in Genesis chapter 2. So the whole description, very echoey of Eden. Well, the land itself is a good land, but like the temple and the tabernacle, it could be tainted by what happens on it. Where we see that explicitly stated is in Leviticus chapter 18, the end of a chapter where God has been giving them their sexual ethics and what they shouldn't do that way. And then here at the end of the chapter, he says this: do not make yourselves unclean by any of these practices, for it was by such things that the nations that I'm driving out before you made themselves unclean. The country has become unclean. Hence, I'm about to punish it for its guilt, and the country itself will vomit out its inhabitants. You, however, must keep my laws and customs and not do any of these hateful things. None of your citizens, none of your resident aliens. For all these hateful things were done by the people who lived in the country before you, and the country became unclean. If you make it unclean, will it not vomit you out, as it vomited out the nations there before you? So although the land is inherently good, it could still be made unclean. And in fact, the people who were living there had made it unclean. And part of why God is bringing the Israelites into that land is as punishment to the people who have been there for their unclean acts. Not just the sexual mores that they have been violating, but also their violence, sacrifice of children, and mistreatment of the poor, all of the bad things that these nations have been doing. It's judgment on them for that, and they will be kicked out. And of course, here in Leviticus, as in other places, the people of Israel are warned that if they take on the habits of the nations that they're driving out, they're going to suffer the same consequence of being driven out of the land themselves. It even seems that the land itself is an active participant. The land knows that it's a good place. The land knows it should be a place of cleanness and even holiness. And when the people violate that, the land is going to vomit them out. When the people come to the land, they go to spy it out. They're going to see this people who have been making the land unclean, and they're going to see that they actually come from a particular heritage. Look at what we see in Numbers chapter 13, 32 through 33. This is after the 12 spies have gone through the land. They presented the report of the land that they explored to the Israelites, saying, the land that we went through to explore is a land that eats its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in its midst are men of great size. There we saw the Nephilim, the descendants of Anak, come from the Nephilim, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their eyes. Well, I'm not exactly sure what the spies meant to say when they said that's a land that eats its inhabitants. Maybe this is one expression of the fact that the land was tired of having these people defiling it, and so this is an affirmation that the land didn't want the people there. These spies seem to be interpreting it as a frightening thing, that if we live there, we might have the same problem. The land itself might be against our living there. What we know they saw were these giant people bigger than themselves, and they called them the Nephilim, the descendants of Anak. We first met the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6, when the sons of God married the daughters of men and had offspring, and the offspring were called Nephilim, and they were described as those men of renown of old. That was a way that some of the nations viewed their distant past founders as these sons of gods marrying human women and having godlike children of themselves, superhuman children like Gilgamesh or other heroes like Hercules. If we want to go Greco-Roman, I mean, Zeus was renowned for having sex with women, earthly women, and having children by them. And a lot of their ancient heroes were supposed to be the children of divine parentage and human parentage mixed. Genesis chapter 6 says, well, that might be true, but the offspring did not have a beneficial effect. The offspring of that unnatural hybrid were destructive. And that's part of why the world was so corrupt that God wiped them all out with a flood. That corruption is a bad influence. And here, the spies come back and say, we see people in this country that they are the Nephilim. They are giant and they're destructive. So how is it that the Nephilim, if they were destroyed by the flood, could be living in the promised land at the time of Moses and Joshua? There are a couple of different theories that get floated around this. I think, for my part, the most likely one is that if the sons of God, the Elohim, could intermarry, if you will, with human women before the flood, they're capable of doing that after the flood as well. And although the literature of the Jews focuses on that first group from Genesis 6, doesn't mean that it's the only one, that it couldn't have happened again after the flood. In fact, even in the Genesis passage, there's phrasing there that says that the Nephilim were in the land even after what? Maybe after the flood. But in any case, they are in the promised land and they have been polluting it. Perhaps the worst offenders of polluting the promised land are these descendants of the Nephilim, because they are descendants of a root violation of God's design. In fact, removing the Nephilim from the promised land and their descendants, not Nephilim per se, perhaps, but the descendants of these Nephilim, the sons of Anak. Another place refers to them as the Rephaim. There are just a couple of different ways that they refer to the people who seem to them to be a result of that violation of God's design. And getting rid of them is one part of it. Them being afraid to go in because of the Nephilim that they saw was such a barrier that when they get to the river Jordan and they're almost about to cross, Moses reassures them that God is going to fight for them, that the giants in the land are not going to be a problem for them. Here in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 1 through 3, Moses talking to them, he says, "Hear, Israel, you're about to cross the Jordan today to go to dispossess nations larger and more numerous than you, great cities fortified with high walls, a great and tall people, the sons of the Anakites, whom you know and of whom you have heard it said, who could stand before the sons of Anak? You should know today that Yahweh your God is the one crossing ahead of you as a devouring fire. He will destroy them, and he will subdue them before you. So you will dispossess them, and you will destroy them quickly, just as Yahweh promised you." And then once they get into the promised land and Joshua leads them through the victories, we'll hop to the end, or kind of a summary statement of the victories of Joshua here in Joshua 11, verses 21 through 23. Notice the emphasis on eliminating the Anakites specifically from the land. At that time, Joshua came and exterminated the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. None of the Anakites were left in the land of the Israelites. Some remained, only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Joshua took all the land according to all that Yahweh had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal divisions, and the land rested from war. One of the main priorities was exterminating the Anakites from the promised land. And this says that Joshua was mostly successful in getting rid of them, except for a couple of different places, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, which we know were the key cities in the Philistine area. And the Israelites, until much later, never really conquered the Philistine towns and cities. They were a major problem. Goliath from Gath is the most famous son of a Nephilim, the descendant of the Nephilim that we have in Scripture. This little verse in Joshua ties us in to David. And I'm not going to go through and read the story of David and Goliath. We know that story pretty well, but Goliath was one of these last remnant of the influence of Nephilim and sons of Anakites in the land of Israel. So this problem persisted from the time of Joshua to the time of David. But in the David's time, they seem to have been wiped out entirely, because the very last time that we read of anybody having problems with the Anakites and their descendants is 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 4 through 8. After this, there arose a war in Gezer with the Philistines. Then Sibbecai the Hushathite struck down Sippai, one of the descendants of the Rephaim. And I mentioned that Rephaim is one of these connected words with Anakites and Nephilim. And they were subdued. And again there was war with the Philistines, and Elhanan, son of Jair, struck down Lachmi, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And again there was war in Gath. And there was a very tall man there. He had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He himself was also a descendant of the Rephaim, and he taunted Israel, but Jehonathan, son of Shemaiah, brother of David, struck him down. These were born to the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. After this, we don't see any direct influence of the giants in the land. This seems to have been the point at which they truly did eradicate the Nephilim and their descendants from the land of Israel. They were only one source of uncleanness. There were problems of all kinds. The priests themselves desecrated the temple, let alone anybody else. Levi's own 2 children desecrated the temple during the lifetime while they were still establishing the sacred space in the law. They desecrated the tabernacle space. Eli's children, the priest who took care of Samuel when he was a child, Eli's kids abused the temple and the tabernacle. We see this abuse over and over. So the temple was never fully sacred. The Israelite camp certainly wasn't. Even Solomon himself built altars throughout the land to the gods of the other nations. His wives followed other gods, and he built altars for his wives' gods. Israelites did that too. The land was never fully holy. And of course, the Gentile nations had more influence on Israel, it seems, than Israel had on them. The hope that God would establish a new sacred space just faded out entirely. And even after the exile, when the Jews returned, it was just never the same. God's presence never filled the temple again, as it had Solomon's temple and the tabernacle before that. This is the situation when Jesus is born. Sacred space is still absent. They work at it. The temple is there. They are sort of pretending it's sacred space, but it really isn't the case.
At the time of Jesus' birth, the status of the temple as sacred space was an open question. Most Jews accepted the temple as sacred, but many did not. The Essenes had completely rejected temple worship and had tried to create their own sacred space in their desert community. As usual, Jesus defies easy categorization. On the one hand, he saw the temple as holy. He drove out the money changers with a whip because they would not respect the house of God. And yet, he also redefined sacred space so that it was not about geography, but about a relationship with him. He became the temple at the center. His ecclesia, or church, took the place of the promised land all around the temple. And taking the place of the Gentile nations were those who had not yet heard or accepted the gospel, the good news of the kingdom of God. In the next lesson, we will take a look at how Jesus reverses the alienation of the Gentile people that happened at the Tower of Babel, opening up the door so that any space can become a sacred space. Thank you for joining me today. As always, I welcome your comments or questions here or in the related Facebook discussion group. May the Lord be with you until we meet again to examine the treasures in the biblical text.